We're getting some disturbing new details from investigators as they try to figure out why that Asiana jumbo jet crash landed at the San Francisco International Airport on Saturday. The chair of the National Transportation Safety Board, Deborah Hersman, is about to join us live. We'll speak to her, get the latest from her. But first, some background. CNN's Dan Simon is in San Francisco right now. He's following the investigation. Dan, what's the latest?
Well, Wolf, we know that the plane was going far below the recommended speed as it approached the runway. We also heard from some of the first responders today who really did some incredible things, but had to field what you might call are some uncomfortable questions about something that may have happened as they raced to the scene. As investigators continue to examine the wreckage, more evidence surfaced today that Asiana Flight 214 was flying too low and too slow to make a safe landing.
About 3 seconds prior to impact, the flight data recorder recorded its lowest speed of 103 knots.
The plane had a target speed for landing of 137 knots, or about 40 miles an hour faster before touchdown.
Look at that one. Look how his nose is up in the air. Oh, my God. Oh, it's an accident.
Investigators still aren't saying whether they believe pilot error led to the crash. But NTSB chairwoman Deborah Hersman made it clear their decisions are being closely reviewed.
Looking for things that might affect human performance, like fatigue, like illnesses or medication.
The pilot at the controls had only limited experience in a Boeing 777, just 43 hours, though many hours flying 747s. But he'd never landed a 777 in San Francisco. This was considered a training flight for him. Just 7 seconds before the crash, the cockpit voice recorder indicates the crew called for an increase in speed. At 4 seconds, the pilots were getting a stall warning. And a second and a half before the crash, the pilots tried to abort the landing. As this animation shows, the plane clipped the seawall, severing its tail, then careens down the runway. Part of the wreckage was found embedded in the seawall's rocks. The NTSB says other pieces of wreckage are in the water.
I have a large plane down. It's well involved in fire, and people are exiting the plane, and the casualty collection point has been established. At that point, I raised it to a third alarm and declared a red alert.
First responders today described a chaotic, surreal scene, arriving just a couple of minutes after the crash. With jet fuel spilling out of the plane, firefighters raced to get inside and found several passengers trapped, all of them in the back of the aircraft where the worst damage was.
They're on the plane involved with fire, and in those wings of that plane is jet fuel. Jet fuel is leaking out of the plane, and our firefighters, under the direction of Anthony Robinson originally and Battalion Chief Mark Johnson, entered the plane, began a primary search, and began to extinguish fire.
But with the heroism comes a possible tragedy. The San Francisco Fire Department acknowledging that one of its emergency vehicles may have run over one of the 2 Chinese girls who died.
There was a possibility that one of their 2 fatalities might have been contacted by one of our apparatus at an unknown point during the incident.
The coroner has not yet determined the cause of death, and so we want to make sure that we have all the facts before we reach any conclusions. We are reviewing video, airport surveillance video, to understand also what happened.
Well, both of the victims who died were seated in the rear of the plane. Meanwhile, investigators were hoping to interview the pilots sometime today. Wolf?
All right, Dan Simon in San Francisco, thank you. Let's get some more from the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board. Deborah Hersman is joining us now live from San Francisco. Thanks very much for coming in. And what can you tell us about those interviews? I understand that they have started today with those 4 Korean pilots.
They have. One of our main priorities is really to conduct interviews and gather perishable evidence in the first hours and days after an accident. Our team is in the process of interviewing the pilots. We want to make sure that we have the opportunity to talk to each of them. There were 4 pilots on this flight, a crew and a relief crew, and so we want to talk to all of them. That process has begun, and we expect good cooperation.
Are they in good shape, those 4 pilots? Did they sustain any injuries?
Well, our team is talking to them. They've all agreed to be interviewed. I don't know if they had any injuries in the accident, but we do know that the worst of the injuries were in the back of the aircraft.
We also have been hearing, and it's pretty disturbing when you think about it, that the pilot who was in charge, and correct me if I'm wrong, really had a tiny bit of experience with this particular Boeing 777 and never actually landed a plane that specific aircraft in San Francisco, which is a tricky landing coming in over the water. Is all that true?
Well, I think first, to step back a little bit, generally when we think of a two-person flight crew, we think of a captain and a first officer. When what we believe that we have in this case is we have a captain that was going through some transition training and some operating experience in the 777. This is somebody with a lot of hours, a lot of experience, but new to the 777. And so he is also flying with a check captain or a training captain who is with him as he's going through this. San Francisco, clearly they're coming in. We want to make sure when we look at this that we've got all of the facts straight about who was the flying pilot in this leg of the flight, who was the pilot in command in the cockpit. And so we've got two captains here. We want to understand that. They did come into San Francisco. They were slow. We know they had a crash on the approach. We would expect in a two-pilot operation for there to be some redundancy and some monitoring that's taking place. We have to understand what went wrong on this flight.
Because they were flying in very slow and very low, and clearly that was a problem. Is it too early to conclude pilot error?
You know, Wolf, I think it really is too early to conclude pilot error because there's so much that we don't know. We have to understand what these pilots knew. We also need to look at how they were flying the airplane. Were they hand flying the airplane? Were they relying on autopilot or some combination of the two of those? And how those systems worked, if they worked as designed, if the crew understood what they were supposed to do. We've seen some of these challenges in previous investigations with respect to automation, and so we want to make sure that we fully understand it before we reach any conclusions.
You've listened to the flight voice recorder. Was there any indication of panic in those seconds before the crash?
You know, Wolf, the cockpit voice recorders left San Francisco just as I was arriving. We had some of our team who was on the ground here in California. They were able to get the recorders off the plane, get them on a red-eye back to Washington for our team to audition them in Washington in less than 24 hours. So that's a great accomplishment. I have not listened to the cockpit voice recorders, so I really can't provide any input as to how the crew sounded.
Well, did your staff, did others at the NTSB give you a sense of what was going on in that cockpit?
They have listened to the recorders. They did a preliminary audition to identify some basic information on them, but they actually have a cockpit voice recorder group that's convening in Washington. One of the issues for us for sure is that we've got a combination of English and Korean on the cockpit voice recorders, and we've got to have some translation done to that before we can release any additional information.
Any preliminary results you want to release right now?
Sure, we have provided some preliminary information from the cockpit voice recorder, and you know, I think what's really important to note is that 7 seconds out, there was a recognition between the two crew members in a conversation that the aircraft was slow. 4 seconds prior to impact, they actually had a stick shaker activation. This is a big deal. This is telling the pilots that the airplane is about to stall if something doesn't change. And so they get an oral, and they also get a cue through the yoke of the aircraft, a vibration, that the airplane is close to stall. And then about 1.5 seconds before impact, there was a call between the crew to go around. And to go around is an aborted landing, apply thrust, and go around and make another pass, try to land again. That was just 1.5 seconds before impact, and at that point it was too late.
Too late indeed, a tragic moment, way too late at that point. Deborah Hersman of the National Transportation Safety Board, if we could check back with you tomorrow, get some more information, that would be great. Thanks very much, and good luck with the investigation.
Thanks, Wolf.
Just ahead, so was it a case of pilot error in San Francisco? We're going to show you some exclusive video to illustrate what may have gone wrong. Stand by for that. And a number of the crash victims have spinal injuries. We're going to show you why and what they may be up against next.